Hey BioGang, so we're going to start our lecture on cell communication, and basically we want to look at how do cells communicate with one another. So if we talk about cell communication, this isn't just for single-celled organisms, this is for multicellular organisms, and when we think about this, basically cells communicate by conducting responses inside cells or signal transduction pathways. And normally that's by a signal that's received at the cell's surface or at its cell membrane, and then that causes a series of reactions inside the cell. Now those reactions could be stimulatory, meaning turning something on, or inhibitory, or turning something off, or stopping a process inside the cell. Because it's so important for cells to be able to respond to their environment and organisms to be able to respond to their environment, these types of processes are always under a lot of selective pressure. So what we'll notice is that many organisms have similar signal transduction pathways. So whether it's a bacteria or an animal, we'll see similar signal transduction pathways, which ultimately shows common ancestry. So if we talk about single-celled organisms, it's how does that one cell respond to the environment? Because if it doesn't respond, then it's dead, and since it's one cell, then it's done. Multicellular organisms, it's more about how do they coordinate all the activities between all the cells to allow the organism to function as a whole. One example of how a single-celled organism would respond to its environment is quorum sensing in bacteria. So bacteria, they release molecules called inducers. And when the density of the population is low, then there's a low amount of inducers. But as the amount of bacteria starts to increase, more and more inducers are produced. And what the inducers do is they induce cell division, which basically increases the population density. So one example would be how bacteria form films. Think about like a film forming on the inside of your mouth, like if you haven't brushed in a while. Sometimes that's bacteria. And one of the bad things about that is that bacteria, when they basically are feeding off the food between our teeth, they start to secrete lactic acid, which can start breaking down the enamel in our teeth and cause cavities. Another example of a single-celled organism would be yeast, and they actually use cell signaling to attract different mating types. So one mating type A, and another mating type, alpha, basically secrete different signals, and they attract one another. It kind of creates a little chemical trail that the other one will follow so it can find the opposing mating type. Once they do, they fuse and they create this new genetically diverse yeast cell. In multicellular organisms, since they're made up of many cells, those cells have to be able to communicate with one another. The easiest way for that is if two cells are in direct contact, then they can actually, if they're directly in contact with one another, sometimes they have little channels between them. Animal cells have gap junctions. We talked about those before in our cell unit. And plant cells have plasmodesmata. It allows chemicals to just very quickly move across. Because the cells are actually have a junction forming between them, sometimes this is called juxtacrine signaling. Another type would be cell-to-cell recognition. So in this case, you have a protein on one cell must bind in a complementary fashion to a protein on another cell and allows the cells to recognize one another. We talked about this in the immune system on how T helper cells will bind to antigen-presenting cells, but they have to do it very specifically. And when that happens, it causes a signal transduction response in the T helper cell, where it starts to divide and secrete signals to tell other nearby white blood cells to divide. The other types of signaling mechanisms in multicellular organisms, paracrine would be when they secrete a signal that affects a cell very close by, and it does that by binding to a receptor on that cell. So it has to be a specific receptor for a specific cell, and then it causes a response. Autocrine, it secretes a chemical signal that causes a response in itself. So some T helper cells do that. Or synaptic signaling would be like when a neuron releases neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters then cause a response in either a gland, telling it to release a hormone, or another neuron, and then continuing a nerve impulse in that neuron. And we'll talk about that when we get to the nervous system. But that's also considered a specific type of paracrine signaling because they're not actually touching one another. It's a signal being released by a neuron that's affecting a very close nearby cell. And then the last two types of signaling in multicellular organisms would go really over a much longer distance. So endocrine hormones would be when an endocrine gland secretes a hormone molecule that then travels through the bloodstream to target cells very, very far from the origin. and then they bind specifically to receptor proteins on the outside of that target cell and cause a signal transduction response in the cell. The last one is neuroendocrine signaling, and then the neuroendocrine signaling would be an example like when the posterior pituitary gland secretes antidiuretic hormone, that goes into the bloodstream and travels to the kidneys. But since it's actually secreted by a neuron and goes to those cells, it's considered a neuroendocrine signaling mechanism. As far as how these different signaling molecules cause responses inside cells, we'll talk about that on the next lesson when we talk about signal transduction pathways.